Hi, it's Lee from Colouring Queen, and let's have a colour and a bit of a story today. I hope you are well. I'm doing well. Thank you very much for all of those people that have sent me messages or commented about all my recent little allergies, itches, all sorts of problems going on here. And excuse the noise in the background, that's Buddy. He's sleeping under my feet and he's snoring and making a little bit of a racket. But anyway, my allergies update, I've got another sort of week to go with some medication and then hopefully I'm all clear. And my birthday, thank you for all of those that wished me a happy birthday last Sunday. Had a nice day. We went out to a little village outside of Brisbane called, I think it's called Samford, and they actually have, we took Buddy, and they have a restaurant there called Collies, which is just all about border collies. And normally they have like these little puppy parties where you can play with border collie puppies and whatnot. But they're actually closed on Sunday, which we didn't expect. But anyway, we had a lovely time. There's lots of lovely restaurants there. And David, surprisingly, he never buys me jewellery, but he bought me a Pandora necklace, so I'm very surprised. But anyway, it was all up a lovely day. Unfortunately, Buddy pulled a bit too hard on his lead with me and popped my shoulder out for, I think, the third time this year. So third time I've decided to put a nose hold here on him, which helps train him not to pull so much. And although I don't like doing it, it has actually worked out really well and he's not pulling me so much, and because I can't keep having my shoulder pop out. So hopefully he gets trained on using it and stops that sort of behaviour soon, because I don't like him wearing it, to be honest. But anyway. So today I thought I'd colour from I Believe In Fairies, postcard set by Klara Markova, and this is for my Bunnies in April colour along. So I thought we've got bunny love, so I thought I would tell you about a story that involves love. Maybe not bunny love, but love nonetheless. And this is an Australian story, so it only really applies to Australia. But I'm sure you might get some enjoyment from it or learn something that might be relevant to the country where you live. And I will need to bleep out one of the words that I'll be using in this story today, because it's a word that upsets YouTube very, very much, but you'll be able to get the gist of it from the story. So here we go. Let me tell you about the lovesick lawyer. So who's the lovesick lawyer? Well, it's a guy called Louis Diprose, and he was a practicing lawyer. At the time this started, he was married, and his first marriage had ended in divorce, and he was going through the process of separating and divorcing his second wife. And at that time he lived in the state of Tasmania in Australia, and it was there that he met Carol Louth in Launceston in 1981. She was married at the time, but her marriage too was about to end, and her husband left her shortly afterwards. She had 2 children and he had 3 children, and when they first met they engaged in a bit of hanky-panky between the sheets shortly after they first met, and then on one occasion about 8 months later. And it seems that Carol put him in the friend zone pretty quick. Louis was far more attached to Carol than she was to him, and he became infatuated with her. Over the years he composed many poems which he called the Mary poems, and Mary was her middle name, and maybe she went by that name rather than her first name. But over the years he created these Mary poems, and they were described as being tender, often sentimental, sometimes passionate, and very often on the theme of unrequited love. And the year after, Carol moved to Adelaide in South Australia, away from Tasmania, and she did that because she was financially strapped, and she was able to move in with her sister and her brother-in-law in a suburb called Tranmere in Adelaide. and that was owned by her brother-in-law, and the rent was really low, so it made sense for Carol to move. She'd be with her sister and paying less money. And Louis tried to get her to stay in Tasmania, and he even proposed to her, but she said no to both. He went over to Adelaide and visited her in January, but Carol wouldn't go out with him because she'd met another man and he didn't want to harass her, so he kind of left her alone. And then a year afterwards, he moved to Adelaide himself with his 3 children from his first marriage, and mainly because Carol was there. And at first he didn't make any contact with her. He was concerned that she might think he was harassing her, but he did send her a partly completed volume of the Mary poems in April, and later on he caught her at home, but a man answered and asked him not to contact her and said that she didn't wish to see him. And poor old Louis, unrequited love, it's a hard thing. I think we've all been there, haven't we? But in May, Carol telephoned him a number of times, but she was happy to talk to him on the phone, but she wouldn't give him her phone number. But about 5 months later, Carol changed her tune and she told Louis that she was really depressed and she'd contemplated suicide, and that maybe Louis could take her out to lunch the next day, which he did, and whatever Carol wanted, basically Louis jumped to do it. He'd bought her gifts and jewellery, television sets, paid her bills, you name it. So Louis continued to phone her and he visited her regularly, as a good friend would do, but he was continuously told how much he was in the friend zone, basically. But he continued to follow her like puppy dog, I guess, and telling her how much he loved her. But he wasn't deterred and he continued to write those lovely love poems, so maybe there was going to be a volume 2 of the Mary collection. Who knows? He bought her things, he bought her jewellery, he bought her things like a washing machine, and from time to time, if he was around there and he seen household bills, he would pick them up and he would pay for them. And she would still continue to call him during this time, but she wouldn't give him her phone number. And in September of that year, Carol's sister and her husband separated. And this was bad news for Carol because she was living in their house and the situation seemed to get a little bit awkward. Now, the husband did mention to Carol that she should be paying a higher rent or putting her name down on the waiting list for low-cost housing, which we have in Australia. But she was told that she couldn't assume that she would continue to live in the house forever, given that the couple was splitting up and it was in the name of her soon-to-be ex-in-law. Carol told Lewis about that conversation. I don't know if it's Lewis pronunciation or Louis, but she enhanced it. She gave it an atmosphere of desperation by saying that she needed to find this accommodation. And at that time, she also showed Louis some scars on her wrists where she had attempted suicide previously. And she said that because of the separation of her sister and brother-in-law, and that her sister wanted the assets all divided up and the house would need to be sold, she would need to vacate and find somewhere else to live. And she told Louis that if she was forced to vacate that house, that she would commit suicide. Now, I don't know what area of law Louis specialised in, but I'm guessing it's not family law, because the ins and outs of family law and a financial divvy-up, they take a lot of time, and it's never easy in my experience. And then once that's done, the house would often be sold so the parties can take the share that they are entitled to. So in May the next year after, in 1985, Louis succumbed to Carol's pressure that she needed accommodation, and he arranged to buy the house in Tranmere for $58,000 from her brother-in-law. The purchase, though, was made in Carol's name, as she claimed that this would make her feel more secure. And Louis, feeling that she was emotionally distraught, he transferred to her the house, but he paid the entire purchase price. So for 3 years on, everything went the same as before. Louis walked around Carol with puppy dog eyes, and she was sort of meh about Louis. He regularly brought food to the house, he paid the bills from time to time, and including Carol's children's school fees for a time. Like all stories, they must come to an end, and in mid-1988 things changed. Louis bought a house in another suburb of Adelaide, and he borrowed the entire purchase price from his mother and a building society, and he had to vacate the house that he was renting before he could move into the new home. And so by arrangement, his son moved into the house that Carol was living in, and in August, Carol said that Louis could also stay in that house as well, while his new house was in the throes of being purchased. And Louis was there for 2 to 3 weeks, and during this time his relationship with Carol just went downhill completely. She had a male friend, and clearly she didn't want Louis around, and they had an argument. And Louis finally grew a backbone and told her that he wanted her to transfer the Tranmere house to him, and he wanted her to pay some rent for her occupation of it. Now clearly Louis was obviously upset about this other man in the situation, but I can understand how he felt, given that you've paid for this and Carol is still treating you badly. But anyway, Carol, unsurprisingly, refused, and she said that the house was hers. And remember, he paid the money, but he put it in her name. So being a good lawyer, Louis did what lawyers love to do, and he sued her. But what on earth could he sue her for? He'd allowed her to have the house in her name. He'd paid the money for it. In most circumstances, that would be considered a gift. If not, it might be a trust, but more likely a gift. And because the property was in her name, in most cases, because that would be considered a gift, there would be no backsies. You can't take back a gift. So Louis did something that was very clever, but also probably a little bit embarrassing for Louis, because he sued Carol in the Court of Equity. Now, the Court of Equity is different from normal courts where you go to fight out about the facts and apply the law. The Court of Equity is all about fairness, where sometimes they realise that some things happen that aren't based on normal common law rules. And equity doesn't apply to all sorts of situations. It's only very limited. And it's a very complex area of law, so I'm not going to go too deep into this. But what Louis claimed was that Carol's behaviour was unconscionable. And there's an area of equity law that relates to unconscionable conduct. And it's all about unfairness or inequality in bargaining power between people. So traditional types of inequality of bargaining power in law are weaknesses like poverty. And this is a legal definition rather than a commentary on people. So poverty, so say for example, if you're in a relationship where you have very little money and the other person has a lot of money. For example, the typical situation is someone wanting a bank loan. The banks are sitting there counting their oodles of billions, and you're looking through your purse looking for coffee money. Or someone in need or sick or perhaps old or suffering some sort of illness, illiteracy. A prime example of this is, say, someone who doesn't speak or understand English and is asked by a bank to sign mortgage documents in English without having any opportunity to have them translated, interpreted, or explained in a manner that they can understand before being asked to sign. The bank clearly has the higher bargaining position. They clearly have the advantage. They created the documents, and the borrower is the one that is desperately in need of the money. So the inequality in Louis and Carol's position is not any of those things that I mentioned. The inequality is that Carol knows that Louis is infatuated with her, and he'll pretty well do anything to please her. So, at the trial of this matter, the court actually agreed with Louis. They actually said that Carol was calculating and she manufactured an atmosphere of crisis with respect to the house when none really existed. She said that if he didn't buy that house or if he didn't help her, that she would harm herself, and him being so in love with her was willing to do anything because she knew how she could influence him. And Louis, the court said, he'd had unhappy domestic experiences in the past, and he was really anxious to lavish love and a devotion on a woman like Carol. And he was infatuated with her, and his infatuation or his love sickness was the behaviour, the inequality in the bargaining power. He was totally infatuated with her, and she was really just disinterested, except when she appeared to need something. That's what it looks like from the court judgments. And the court said that Louis was entitled to the land because it would be unconscionable or unfair for Carol to retain it in the circumstances. His willingness to devote himself to her and to lavish her with gifts, notwithstanding that she didn't return his feelings, the court said is quite pathetic. Now, I can imagine how Louis must feel, because this case is pretty famous in Australia. It's famous among law students. It's one that's always studied if you do equity law in Australia. And it's very famous among lawyers who get a little bit of a joke or a little bit of a laugh at Louis' expense about being so lovesick. But the court found in his favour, so although it must have been incredibly embarrassing for him to launch these proceedings, it worked out in the end for Louis. Carol appealed the decision and she lost. And then she appealed to the High Court of Australia, which is our last port of call. There is nowhere else to go. And the High Court agreed with the original court. They said that she had manufactured an atmosphere of crisis where nothing really existed, and that Louis was in a position of emotional dependence on her, and purchasing the house, there was only one reason for it, and that was in her own interests, and her conduct was unconscionable. It was calculated to induce, and actually did induce, a transaction conferring a benefit on her. And so Carol was ordered to give back the house to Louis. So not every country has this area of law in it, unconscionable conduct. And usually it's for those things that I said before, like being illiterate or impoverished, or your age might be a factor, or illnesses, etc. But this is the first one I know of where being lovesick is the inequality. And it still does make me laugh a little bit to think of it, because most people imagine lawyers to be, I don't know, often objective, and to have these feelings and to go to these sorts of lengths. It just doesn't seem like the normal situation that you would think about a lawyer, I guess. But I know lots of lawyers, and I don't know any of them that would bring this action. But, good on him for doing it, and he got the money back for his house. And it seems that poor old Louis is very unlucky in love. Like, this is what, the second, third relationship that hasn't gone well for him. But maybe by now he's found a nice woman, or maybe he's just given up. I don't know. But I'd love to know what you guys think of Louis. Do you think he should have got the house back, or do you think it was a gift, or do you think, Carol should be still living in the house? I'd love to know what you think, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, what I think about Louis or what I think about Carol, because the court's already decided it and there's no backsies from the High Court. So I guess what we can learn from this is just to be careful about the relationships that you form and who you give things to. And so I guess we all need to be careful about the types of gifts that we give to people, and when they're really expensive, like a house, you might want to give them a bit more thought than you would, say, if you bought them a packet of pencils, packet of Crayolas. But I think it's always interesting the way that the law can change. It's like a living fluid, but sometimes it's a little bit slow, but sometimes it's a little bit faster than we'd expect, because personally I wouldn't have expected love sickness or infatuation to be an area of unconscionable conduct for many years, and it's surprising to me often that it was so long ago that this case was decided and people decided that yes, that can produce this unequal bargaining power that they're talking about. I don't know. I'd love to know what you guys think. Oh, I forgot to tell you another thing. I got a new printer this week. It's actually not new. I bought it on Facebook Marketplace. I love Facebook Marketplace because it's just such a great way to get a bargain. And I found ever since not having a job that I'm always looking for some sort of a bargain to make my pennies go further. But I've got a Canon printer, which is what I use to print out my pictures that I colour in with pencil. But for markers, I've always wanted a laser printer because the ink apparently it melts into the paper, and so it doesn't go smudging as much as the inkjet printer, which my Canon is. So I was able to pick up a lovely Brother laser printer off Facebook Marketplace for $20, and oh my god, it is such a difference. I've had so much fun playing with it, and it is so fast, and printing out paper for use with markers is a breeze with it. So I'm just so glad, because I really didn't want to buy a printer, and when I took some pictures to colour in with markers over to Officeworks through the week, my marker paper actually jammed up their machines and they couldn't print it on it. So I thought, what on earth can I do? And I looked for other printers in the suburb that could print out my digital downloads to colour on marker paper, and I couldn't find anyone, and that's why I went to Facebook Marketplace to buy the laser printer so I can print it out myself. But I'm so glad that I did. Every bit of paper that I'm putting through it seems to be working really well. So if you're ever looking for a printer, go to Facebook Marketplace. It's often where I buy all sorts of things. I think I told you last year or something, I bought a pile of Copic markers from a lady that was changing from her chows to the sketch markers, and she was getting rid of her chows, and I bought I think from memory it was about 20 or maybe 25, and out of all of them there was only one or two where the ink was a bit dry and I got a refill for it, but it worked out so much cheaper because all the tips were fine, and worked out so much cheaper than buying them all new. So always check out Facebook Marketplace if you need to get some colouring supplies or things. And the reason that I'm telling you about the printer is that this week, hopefully, I'll be uploading the video on the best paper for markers, because I'm probably going to be using a few more markers lately and my wrist is playing up with the pencils. So yeah, that's similar to the best paper video that I did for pencils, so keep an eye out for that one. So I think that's it for me. I'm going to finish up my little bunny rabbit here, and probably going to outline it with some white Posca paint. Now, we never have a good relationship, Posca and I. It never turns out like all those beautiful pictures I see you guys do on Instagram. I'm always picking it off with my fingernail afterwards, but we'll see at the end if it actually worked out for me this time or not. But that's it from me. Until next time, stay safe and happy colouring.